In this video, I want to answer the question, what is the change curve? Actually, the question, what is the change curve, is a slightly false question because there are many change curves. You can find all sorts of variants on it, but most of them track back to one of two models, either as the Satir model of change or the Kubler-Ross model of change, which is probably better known. The Kubler-Ross model is actually a model of how people handle grief, perhaps the biggest change of all. And it suggests we go through a number of phases. We start off in denial, then we get angry, then we start bargaining. We start trying to say, well, if only I'd done this, or if only I'd done that. Sometimes if people have faith, they bargain with their deity. And then they move into depression, they get sad, they face up to the reality that there is nothing they can do, there's no amount of bargaining that will bring the person back, and then they move finally into acceptance. And this change curve is often represented as a kind of U-shaped curve. Various people have taken the change curve and adapted it to organisational change, and perhaps the most famous of those was Cynthia Scott and Dennis Jaffe. And they took that curve and they plotted it onto a 2x2 matrix, where the top half represents externally focused emotional states or behaviours, and the bottom half represents internally self-oriented states. And to the left of the diagram, they represent a focus on the past, while to the right of the diagram, it's a focus on the future. Consequently, we move along a curve which starts in the top left with denial, refusing to accept that the organisational change is going to happen. And then we move into a more internally focused resistance to the change. And then we move towards the future by exploring the opportunities and the reality of the change. And finally, we return to an external focus and a future-oriented focus of committing to the change. And you'll find lots of variants of this out there in the literature. I myself have a preferred model which I use to train people. On this, on the horizontal axis to the left, I represent negative states with regard to the change, whilst on the right, positive. And at the top of the chart, more emotional states, and at the bottom of the chart, more rational states. And I start the chart with denial, but I don't recognise denial as being on the chart, because I don't think when people are denying the change, they're actually engaging with it. We move onto the chart at the top left in an emotional and negative state. We're either angry, or we're upset, or we're frustrated, or we're bitter about the changes that we've heard about. And we gradually work through those emotions, and then we become more rational, and we start to find a dozen good reasons why the change shouldn't happen, and that's resistance. Resistance is a much more rational state of mind, but it's still negative. But working through the rational assessment of the change, that's when we're susceptible to a rational argument in favour of the change, and we can move into a more positive rational state of exploring the opportunities and what that change means. And if we explore the changes and we find them good for us, that's the point where we start to move into acceptance of those changes. And finally, we move off the chart because we're now no longer thinking of it as change, we are totally committed. So there's three of the many models of change and how change works, and these are all represented by a curve, the change curve, and these change curves are used to help people understand the emotional and behavioural traits that are going on when we create change with our projects, and you can also use them to predict what will happen and to plan accordingly.